Thank you very much, and thank you both for your excellent testimony. As I mentioned at the beginning of this hearing, we are here in large part because of the request of Congressman Ellison and Congressman Crowley, and so I'd like to yield to them for any statements and any questions they have first. So, Mr. Ellison.
Allow me to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Wolf, and my colleague Joe Crowley. Mr. Chairman, I come to this not through reading reports, not through any human rights alerts that I got from various organizations, but from dear, close personal friends of mine who find their family roots in Bangladesh. Close friend of mine, one in particular, but it grew to many, many more, came to me and said, "Look, Keith, you're in Congress. I've never traded on our friendship before, but I need you to know that I'm absolutely beside myself with fear when it relates to my family and the human rights situation in Bangladesh." And these are people who may have immigrated from Bangladesh to the United States, but they're Americans, but they love Bangladesh and they care about Bangladesh, and they believe Bangladesh is a great society and can be a greater one, but not without addressing these important human rights issues. So I come to that with that spirit, one friend to another, recognizing the potential, understanding the importance of addressing issues. And nothing takes away from the greatness of Bangladesh as a nation, certainly not facing a serious human rights problem. America has faced its own internal human rights problems, and it hasn't diminished us as a nation. In fact, it's made us a greater nation. So I say that clearly believing that these situations can be addressed in effective ways. I have become particularly concerned about recent reports of forced disappearances and extrajudicial killings that are taking place in Bangladesh. These crimes are targeting opposition leaders, labor leaders, and taking place at an alarming rate. My understanding is that the justice is not being brought to the perpetrators of these crimes. If they are, I'd like to hear what is in fact being done. I hope that panels here today can help shed light on what the U.S. can do to help. The fact is that we understand this is an internal Bangladesh issue, but when it comes to the issue of international human rights violations are the issue of everyone across the globe. I'm also very concerned about labor rights in Bangladesh. The United States buys a large amount of merchandise from Bangladesh, specifically garments and seafood. I have long been concerned that international trade can lead to a race to the bottom. Though I believe that trade is necessary and important and essential to the well-being of all, it should be done with a due regard to the human rights issues and labor rights. I've also been following the International Crimes Tribunal in Bangladesh, and I'm somewhat concerned by the proceedings so far. While I support and applaud the Bangladeshi government desire to bring justice to those responsible for committing atrocities in the 1991 conflict, I am concerned that the proceedings be conducted in a fair, transparent manner, and I know that Human Rights Watch has asked the Bangladeshi government to investigate threats to defense lawyers and witnesses. The hallmark of any fair judicial proceeding is that advocates be allowed to advocate and not have to fear for their own safety as they speak up on behalf of a client. I look forward to hearing more about that issue. I'd also like to thank the witnesses today. The witnesses are participating in the hearing this afternoon. Do so with a great degree of learning, understanding, and care for the subject matter. So with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Wolf, the co-chairs of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, really the Human Rights Caucus of the House of Representatives. And Chairman, you have been a long-standing champion of defending the rights of people not only here in the United States but throughout the world. And I know that you've been no stranger to Bangladesh as well. You and I have from time to time have talked about the issues of Bangladesh and how pleased we all were with the election of Keith Ellison to Congress, because I knew that immediately someone else would have a an affinity towards the developing world, but particularly the people of Bangladesh, and understand the contributions of Bangladesh to the world today, but maybe more importantly, as you do in your own constituency, the contributions they're making back in your district. And I can speak from my own constituency. I oftentimes have to remind my own constituents when they come to see me that I'm neither an Awami League Democrat nor am I a BNP Democrat. I'm just a Democrat from Queens, New York. But I think by that statement, it does, I think, again, piggyback on what you said about the concern that Bangladeshi Americans have for their homeland. And that is someone of Irish descent that I can say that as well. I always look back and want to know what's happening there and how things are going. Maybe less so, well, maybe more so now, most recently, given the crisis in Europe. But for a while there, we saw the advancement became, especially in the peace process, and became less and less of an issue here in the front pages of America. But I do know that in the burgeoning country of Bangladesh, there's a great deal of concern about the development of Bangladesh as it moves forward. As Ambassador Blake, you and I have had a long standing relationship as it pertains to this great nation of Bangladesh, and I've watched it grow through some very struggling periods and times. And Ambassador Beale, I appreciate the work that you've been doing in terms of labor and really bringing to the world, not only as it pertains to the problems in Bangladesh for the sake of our information, but for the world to know as well, the advancements. We expect a great deal from the United States. We just don't look outward. We also look inward, and we recognize that we are not a perfect nation. And there are many things we can point to here. So we recognize that. We say that about ourselves, so that gives us an opportunity to look out. And I know that there are a number of areas of concerns that we have, and I think it's also important to extol the virtues and some of the positive things that are happening in Bangladesh. And we applaud especially the fair and free elections that took place, and that's an important aspect. How things move forward with the change in the Constitution and the removal of the caretaker system, and what role that will have in the future. And I think many of us can make observations, especially in this go-round, in favor and opposed to some of the things that happened during the caretaker regime. But that is an issue that we have concerns about. What will be the future of democracy with a small d in Bangladesh? I have also concerns about some, as was mentioned before, the extrajudicial killings that have taken place, and missing persons that have taken place. But in particular, as you have mentioned, Aminul Islam, and his brutal murder, identifying and arresting those who are accused of that particular human rights violation, and the need to bring those responsible for that murder to justice. I'm also have had an ongoing concern about the Rohingya refugees from Burma, and I'm concerned, and I think we're disappointed when people who are fleeing conflict or in their own land are not recognized as citizens in their own country, and are fleeing harm's way, and to have women and children being turned back. I don't think it looks positively on the people of Bangladesh. I know that's not who they are about and what they're about. I think they're peace-loving people and want to see advancements not only for themselves but for their neighbors. In the ongoing conflict, we know that Aung San Suu Kyi will be here in the United States in September, and I hope to be able to raise the issue of the Rohingya Muslim population in Burma with her as well. But Ambassador Blake, could you let us know if you have any knowledge as to whether women, children, and infant refugees were denied entry into Bangladesh from the Rohingya Muslim population in Burma? I don't think it's the fault of the Bangladeshi government that the Rohingya are mistreated in their homeland, as I mentioned, but I hope to see the Bangladeshi moving towards allowing the Rohingya refugees that are looking for refuge in Bangladesh and are fleeing not only fear, but I think actual physical harm. And would we be really more respectful of international law if they were to allow those individuals to have refuge within Bangladesh? If you can comment on that.
Certainly, Congressman. Thank you very much. And again, thank you for your interest. Like you, we remain very concerned about the ethnic and sectarian tensions inside Burma that have precipitated a lot of these movements. I think it's important to note that Bangladesh, as you know, Congressman, has supported more than 250,000 Rohingyas in Bangladesh for more than 30 years. Most of those are economic migrants and not so much refugees. But we have consistently made the point to the government of Bangladesh that, as you say, they have an international obligation to try to help those who are fleeing violence in Burma right now. So we've urged the government of Bangladesh to continue its policy of non-refoulement. And to answer your direct question, what they've done is that they have provided emergency assistance, food and water, blankets and medicine, but then they've turned all of those people back over to Burma. So they have not allowed people in permanently to add to the population that they already have there. So we've expressed our concern about that policy for the reasons that I just spoke of. And we've also said that we and the UN High Commission for Refugees stand ready to provide economic assistance to the government to help them to the extent that they need that to help provide for these refugees.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know how much time we have. Can I just continue? Do you have any observations you can add for us right now as to what the Rohingya people would face if they are, when they are not, when they are denied access to Bangladesh and refuge in Bangladesh in terms of being vis-a-vis their own country, that where they have no citizenship?
Right. I mean, obviously they face the same kind of persecution and violence that they are fleeing, and that's why it's so important for Bangladesh to allow them to come into the country, and particularly, as you say, for the women and children who are the most vulnerable sections of the population.
Aside from fear, which in of itself is stress, do they face physical harm?
Most definitely. There's been some very serious violence against them, particularly in the state of Rakhine there, and so that again, it underscores the importance of allowing people in and continuing this policy and indeed respecting their international obligations to help these people.
I appreciate your observations, and it's not been lost on me what the Bangladesh government has done in terms of providing for refuge for a considerable number of refugees within its borders. But I have concerns about, again, especially all human life, but especially women and children. That may be just something that goes back into our history, dating back to the Titanic, maybe. But certainly also, I think, qualifies in terms of our concerns today. Ambassador Beale, could you just comment possibly, and then I'll turn it back to the chairman. I'd like to understand further where things stand in terms of moving forward with the Better Work labor protection program in Bangladesh. A few years ago, it was suggested that this international labor organization, ILO program, would be implemented in Bangladesh to help monitor labor rights. What are the challenges to implementing the Better Work program, and what are the opportunities going forward? And do you think this program can work in Bangladesh? I know you're talking about the informal garment sector, but is this something that can work in Bangladesh, in your opinion?
Thanks very much, Congressman Carley, for the question. Really a three-part process without overcomplicating this concerning Better Work in Bangladesh. First, there was a feasibility study last year. That was something that we helped the administrators of the Better Work program, jointly the ILO and the IFC, get underway. That goes through the elements of what would be necessary to have a program get launched. What then happened was the beginning this past January of a detailed design phase review, which will be completed in the next several weeks by September. That we've been in constant touch with the ILO and the IFC. As a matter of fact, 2 weeks ago we hosted the head of the Better Work program, Dan Reese, who is in from Geneva with his team representing Better Work officials, not just from those who'd be working in the future in Bangladesh, but also from Cambodia, Indonesia, Nicaragua, Haiti, Lesotho, and so on, to talk about the program as a whole. Obviously, a number of precedents for how it might work in Bangladesh, Vietnam as well. When we get the results of those, if they're prepared to move forward, we will commit resources to help in the first year of the Better Work program and hopefully beyond. It's a challenge because of the number of factories. In the case of Haiti, for example, Better Work administers roughly 23, 25 factories, goes in monitors, training and remediation that we help them with, and public reporting on factory conditions. In the case of Bangladesh, you'd be talking not 23 to 25, but thousands. And so one decision that needs to be made would be the scope of the program. Is there an effort to make it mandatory across the entire sector? If not, that may be impractical in the near term. How do you create leverage and create incentives with buyers to source from the better the factories that would be part of Better Work, where we'd hope the working conditions would be models for the rest of the industry? So there's a lot on the table. We'll know a lot more when this design phase is completed in September, and we'd be delighted to come back and talk to you or your staff at that point about next steps. I think, without knowing the results of the design phase, that given the various interests of stakeholders, there is strong demand to launch Better Work in Bangladesh. And again, if the decision is made to move ahead, we can share with you the blueprint for doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, if I could ask just if Ambassador Blake could comment on what was raised by my colleague, Mr. Ellison, that being the War Crimes Tribunal. Can you give us any observations that from state as it pertains to that?
Yes. We've followed this tribunal very, very closely. We believe as a nation in the importance of accountability, but we also didn't want to see this tribunal become used for political purposes and to in any way undermine some of the existing political parties, specifically the Jamaat Islami. So we made a decision that we would engage with the government and try to help bring the ICT of Bangladesh up to international standards. So our ambassador, Ambassador Stephen Rapp, who heads our Office of Criminal Justice, traveled to Bangladesh in early 2011 at the invitation of the government, I should say, to provide them with advice. He has written to the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Law, the Minister of Justice and Parliamentary Affairs on ways in which the ICT can be strengthened. I think that he feels that several of his suggestions have been met, particularly with respect to some of the rules changes regarding the ICT. But he's also expressed concern that the ICT has not yet defined this term crimes against humanity in a manner that is consistent with international law, and it has not guaranteed defendants in ICT proceedings the same rights that are accorded defendants in other court cases in Bangladesh. So we've also been working with NGOs on the ground there to try to make the ICT trials accessible to the public and, again, more accountable in that way. So in sum, we have engaged very strongly and very consistently on this, and we'll continue to do so.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, let me just follow up on that. So, have we made progress on the ICT? I mean, we've heard reports of attorneys not being able to meet with their clients, and again, this a process that is anything but transparent. I mean, this process is in place, and people are being arrested. Is this a credible process, or notwithstanding Ambassador Rapp's suggestions, I guess, where are we in that? How do we view the actions of the International Criminal Tribunal
well, as
it now stands?
Yeah. As I said, Mr. Chairman, I think we welcome the fact that the government of Bangladesh sought international help and really tried to bring their ICT up to international standards, but we think that there's still some shortcomings, and so there's still more work to be done.
The suggestions that Ambassador Rapp made that they took, do you know what they are?
Yeah, as I said earlier, they talked about, again, changing some of the rules, particularly about due process and other kind of procedural types of things.
But have they changed the rules?
You know, I can't tell you. I can, if you want, I can arrange a separate briefing.
No,
for
I
you,
would,
'cause
I'd be
don't-
curious, because I mean, I think that's a, this is a human rights commission, and one of the, one of the things that we talk about at almost every hearing is this issue of impunity and
Right.
due process. We want to make sure that people who commit crimes against humanity or any kind of terrible human rights crime are held accountable.
Right.
You also want to make sure the process is legitimate and transparent, and it's not being used, for political purposes.
Sure.
And it's not something that's done in secret, so nobody has any confidence with whatever the outcome is. So that would be very, very helpful.
So we'll be glad to have Ambassador Rapp come up and give you a briefing about that.
Yeah, the other issue with regard to impunity is with regard to this Rapid Action Battalion, which is, human rights organizations have reported in great length about how this battalion has committed serious human rights violations, yet they are protected and not held accountable for their crimes. I know that the U.S. has pushed for better accountability on human rights abuses conducted by security forces like the Rapid Action Battalion, it doesn't seem like there's been a lot of progress in that area. If I'm wrong on that, correct me. I mean,
Yeah.
What more can be done to improve the use of force standards in Bangladesh?
Well, as Human Rights Watch and others have said in their reports, I think there's a long-standing record of torture and mistreatment and extrajudicial killings by the Rapid Action Battalion. We've really sought to try to engage with them to try to change that and change their culture. And I think that we've had some effect. I don't want to overstate that. There's been some improvement in their human rights record. As I said in my opening remarks, we've worked with them to establish an internal inquiry cell within the RAB, which was in response to a request from them. And we embedded a former marshal, a former law enforcement agent in the RAB to stand that up. We're now in the process of expanding on that to help sending somebody back now to sort of strengthen that cell further. I guess one way to measure this is, as I was preparing for this hearing, I asked for the statistics from some of Bangladesh's own human rights organizations about extrajudicial killings. And ODICAR, which is one of the most widely and highly regarded institutions in Bangladesh, reports that the RAB extrajudicial killings have come down. In 2010, they were 83. In 2011, they were 51. And so far this year, they're 34. So there's been some progress, but again, there's still a very large number there.
Absolutely.
And that's something that's got to be. We'll continue.
It's hard to say that there's progress when there's already been 34
That's right.
extrajudicial killings as of this year, and we're in July.
Right.
That is a great concern. Going back to the issue of the Rohingya refugees, has the recent opening of U.S. relations with Burma had any impact on U.S. policy toward the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh? I mean, has this been an issue that's been talked about with the Burmese authorities? And what, if anything, has the United States done to improve the circumstances faced by the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh? You mentioned that we made an offer to provide some assistance, but
Right.
Was that offer accepted, or?
Well, no, because they didn't accept more refugees into the country, but we have had provided assistance in the past. They do have, no one really knows the exact number of Rohingyas that are in Bangladesh, but it's somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000, of whom 29,000 are actually registered in camps, and so we do provide assistance through through our office of.
And do we have any idea how many of these refugees are repatriated on a monthly or basis?
None are repatriated.
None
They've all been in Bangladesh for a very long period of time, some as long as 30 years. And they don't want to go back, so they're not going to be forcibly repatriated. They quite understandably are very concerned about the situation back in Burma. It's possible to envision a circumstance where in the future conditions might improve sufficiently in Burma whereby they might be willing and might in fact seek to try to be repatriated back, but those don't yet exist.
Mr. Beal, I think Mr. Crowley mentioned in his questions about all the U.S. companies that are doing business in Bangladesh, and again, I just want to be clear about. I mean, we talk about good corporate citizens and not so good corporate citizens. I mean, how would you rate, the behavior of U.S. companies that are in Bangladesh in terms of, are they not exploiting labor? Are they paying a fair wage? Are they kind of adhering to a set of international standards when it comes to labor rights? I mean, how would you classify our behavior in that?
Sure. Thanks for the question. It's hard to say one size fits all. There have been some examples of leadership. I mentioned, for instance, PVH in stepping up both the Fire Safety Code, working with leading international NGOs like the Worker Rights Consortium, the International Labor Rights Forum, and others to develop that. On the other hand, to date, other brands have not stepped forward to join that. I know that's a source of frustration for some of the NGOs that work very closely with PVH. In terms of conditions in the ready-made garment sector, we were encouraged when we held the Buyers Forum last year. We're encouraged when we see the joint letters that leading brands have sent out in the aftermath of the Amin al-Islam killing, the June 21st letter, which was very constructive in our view in talking about the fact that the failure to enforce the minimum wage law increase passed in 2010 has resulted in a deterioration of conditions for workers. On the other hand, as I mentioned, oftentimes, and we talk about this all the time in our dialogue with buyers, and it's not just in Bangladesh, it's in other countries, Cambodia, Haiti, you name it, it may be pressures from those buyers that create conditions in the factories that lead to everything from unsafe working conditions to excessive overtime, and ultimately other violations of internationally recognized worker rights. So it's an ongoing process. I met just yesterday with one of the leading brands to talk not just about Bangladesh but other countries in which better work is engaged. The most effective way is to stress to the brands, as they've themselves said in public statements, that if conditions don't improve, as you well know, in a global economy, they will look elsewhere. And there are other countries in the region and elsewhere in the world where there are opportunities to source at relatively low wages. And so it's important that they use the leverage, their market pressure. Their market pressure can be a source of lowering standards. It can also be a source of raising standards. And so one thing that the Better Work program can enable us to do is really have an organized mechanism in place. As I mentioned, the components of that are the three things you need to work with the brands on: monitoring, remediation, and public reporting, transparency. So there are some other details we can share if you don't already have it in the record, the letters that the brands sent after the killing and again on June 21st. But the dialogue will continue. I think it's fair to say it's been a mixed record, but some brands have been outspoken in support of raising standards.
Just one final question for either of you. How has the United States responded to DACA's proposed 2011 Foreign Donations Act amendment, which some are concerned would constrain significantly a lot of the work of civil society organizations, and put significant constraints on foreign donations. I guess my question to you is, what is our opinion on that, and how might this impact USA contributions to Bangladeshi civil society organizations beyond the already existing constraints on foreign donations?
Do you want to? Mr. Chairman, we've expressed concern in general about some of the policies with regard to civil society in Bangladesh. We feel that, again, as I said, civil society in many ways has been a cornerstone of the success of Bangladesh. And so efforts to try to erode the role of civil society we view with great concern. We actually arranged for an expert to go out and talk to the Bangladeshis and give them some expert advice about this law. And we'll continue to talk with them about this, because I think, again, if there's anything that sort of is in the DNA of Bangladesh and has been something that has been one of the core of their strengths, has been the strength of their civil society, and so we don't want to do anything and don't want to see anything happen that will again diminish that role.
Thank you. You have any questions?
I'm good.
I think we're all set. Thank you very much for your testimony. We appreciate it very much. Oh,
Before
you leave,
let me just
Mr.
ask if
Crowley.
I can, just a quick follow-up with Mr. Beal as it pertains, and just a further clarification, do you think it's a plus benefit or a minus negative, I guess you could say, or, of American corporate presence in Bangladesh today?
I think on balance it's a benefit in that certainly what we see not just in Bangladesh but in other countries is typically U.S.-based brands tend to be well above the curve, leaders on corporate responsibility, particularly those who've been willing to engage in multi-stakeholder initiatives and work not just in terms of their own internal monitoring but allow and work with independent third-party monitors to come into the factories through different initiatives. That's something that often can push buyers from other parts of the world and domestic buyers to do more as well. So I think it has tremendous potential to be a net benefit. We need to encourage more of the buyers to be involved because all too often it's still kind of a small subset of the buyers who are engaged in these CSR corporate accountability initiatives, and the challenges, as I mentioned, in the case of the fire safety code, it's a good start, but given the record and the number of incidents, to have one leading multinational affiliated with NGOs working on that isn't enough. But on balance, it has more upside potential, and we are by no means in linking labor conditions to the trade benefits. The goal is to push those conditions upward, not to have investment dry up and companies to move out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony. We're very grateful. We'll call our second panel, Mr. Tim Ryan, Asia Regional Program Director, American Center for International Labor Solidarity, and Mr. John Sifton, Director, Asia Advocacy, Human Rights Watch. Hey, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Nice to see you.
Good job. Excellent job.